Rukmini, thank you so much for being here today.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
The whole point of these chats is that whoever watches these, they might learn a thing or two that's new, and the topics are normally oriented around um, topics that the other person is passionate about.
Okay.
So to start, you and I obviously have known each other for a while.
Mm.
We are siblings, and you have offered to be on this series because you have a lot of interesting things to share, particularly about public policy.
Mhm.
Maybe you could start a little bit about the journey. Would that be a good point to start?
Yeah, let's do it. And I think it's really interesting that I, as your sister, am also speaking about this because we have a shared upbringing, obviously. We've traveled around the world a lot. I know Arjun's spoken about this a little bit earlier on his channel. And so, because of that, we've been fortunate enough to be exposed to a lot of different cultural contexts and, most importantly, developing contexts. And I think that's where my interest in public policy, governance, public administration, and those are all buzzwords, and I can go into them a little bit, but that's where my interest arose, is just in living in different developing contexts. So specifically, we're from India, so we would go back to India a lot. We lived in Egypt for a while, we lived in the UAE, and each of these economies and each of these countries looked very different from one another. And so it was in comparing the lived experiences of different people across these countries that I started wondering, like, why is it that we have gaps in service delivery to different individuals? Why is it that some people have access to certain medical services and food and some people don't? And I'm sure you saw this as well growing up, right? Some of those differences.
Yeah, I saw the disparity, especially in Egypt versus the Gulf countries.
Mm-hmm.
I think Egypt had less of an expatriate population,
Mm-hmm.
and I think they had more people that were unemployed. Um, the economy wasn't as based on the expatriate population, it was developing,
Mm-hmm.
and there was also quite a bit of wealth polarization. So these are all things that I noticed in Egypt,
Yeah.
which I think were congruent with what we see in India as well.
Totally, exactly. And so I think those were the most stark data points for me
Yeah.
in grounding my interest in public policy and development, is sort of seeing the gap in access and the gap in lived experience and lifestyle for people. Specifically in 10th grade, as a part of our high school, we were encouraged to do community service. Very grateful for that education as well. Shout out Cairo American College. Um, so I actually had a chance to volunteer at an orphanage, a local public orphanage, and I was working with 7 to 8 year old children, and they came back every day from school and were asking for homework help, and they would open their notebooks and there would be nothing written in their
Oh
notebooks.
gosh.
And they were going to an English medium school, in which case, like, the instruction was supposed to be in English, and these kids not only didn't understand or speak English, couldn't even write English. And it was that spoke to me so severely, is that here I was in this incredibly resourced international school, sitting alongside these children who have, not even a scratch, on the surface of, like, that resource acquisition or resource allocation towards my education. So that's kind of where it started for me, and that's how I got into not just education, but specifically looking at development gaps. And that's actually what started my interest in education policy. So looking at the way in which we design instructional experiences for students, the way in which we deliver them to students, and not just students at the top, not just students in private international schools, but students in low-income private schools, students in public schools.
Mhm.
I'll pause there. I know I'm going really fast, but
No, it makes sense. So those are the beginnings,
mm,
I guess, for what kind of encouraged you to explore public policy,
yeah,
looking at things at a more grassroots level.
totally.
Hmm. And from there, how did you progress? You studied international relations.
I studied international relations
Yep.
in university in the United States, which allowed me to start providing some academic basis for this very
Yeah.
anecdotal lived experience of mine. And so I read a lot about, like, income inequality through an economic lens, through a political lens, through a social lens. And I think all of that was really important in providing, like, an academic and research oriented framework for the realities I was seeing on the ground. And thereafter, I went back to the ground because that's honestly where my heart is like in working with people. And so I went back after I graduated from college. I applied to teach for India, which is a fellowship program based in India. And essentially, fellows who make it to the fellowship are assigned to a low income private or a public school in a city in India. And the idea, the theory of action around the organization is um, individuals who are not currently engaged in the education sector, who are not qualified to teach necessarily, are invited to come in under the assumption that someone with external experiences, someone from external to the classroom, excuse me, may be able to add more value to the classroom in a developing context than someone who is already in the system. And that's just a question of like, it's like the argument of fresh eyes, right? If you're writing something, you get so attached to it and you look at it so many times that it's really hard to be discerning. And so that's kind of the philosophy that undergirds Teach for India is fresh perspectives could lead to innovation. Does that make sense?
But I think the Teach for India, it's part of a bigger umbrella called the Teach for.
Teach for all.
Teach for all.
Yeah.
And this is basically a parent organization, NGO,
That's right.
which operates in many countries,
That's right. Yes.
like in Africa, Asia,
Across the
and
world, yeah.
it's quite demanding, isn't it? Teach for India, I've heard. It is quite demanding, and they get quite qualified people in terms of their academic qualifications. The people who are teaching are quite qualified, but even for them, it's very demanding. You have metrics that you need to reach, right? How are these metrics measured in terms of meeting the outcomes that that Teach for India has set out for you?
Interesting. So you're looking at like performance
Metrics,
in
yeah,
Teach for
yeah.
India? Okay.
Yeah.
We are not held to strict performance standards, but we are, I mean, we're, sure,
Yeah.
I'm assuming that's still how things are, but
Yeah.
we were asked to focus on the development of specific like instructional skills. So it was really important, for example, in the classroom to make sure that we were doing certain practices and protocols every day. So in terms of our performance standards, Teach for India has really clear expectations that they set with fellows for protocols that need to be practiced in the classroom. So things like making sure that you are constantly setting expectations for behavior for students, and you have a clear understanding of kind of protocols in the classroom, ensuring that there is a system in place for class. So, for example, something I did, it's a really fun anecdote, was I was a big fan of Coldplay at the time, and I played Sky Full of Stars for the students. And at the start of every class, I would play Sky Full of Stars for 2 minutes. And the students knew that they had 2 minutes to take out their notebooks, open to the next page, write the date, write the title that I had on the board, and show that they were ready for the class to begin. So protocols like that were a really important part of the Teach for India classroom, and that's what we were measured against, and that's the kind of way in which performance was appraised. So in terms of how Teach for India kind of framed my next steps beyond that, if you don't mind, can I talk about kind of what happened after Teach for India? Okay. So it did two things for me. It allowed me to see kind of resource gaps in education. So the way in which public school contexts are obviously determined by the level of city and state allocation in terms of just pure money, like fiscal terms, towards schools. So if, for example, a city or a state is not prioritizing, let's say, physical education, they're not going to allocate money towards physical education, which means that students straight up don't get periods for like time allocated for physical education and sport during the day. And when you think about the age, like when you think about growing children, it's really important to have that regular physical activity and to continuously engage.
Especially for emotional regulation.
Absolutely. And for team sports, like learning collaboration, learning. I was teaching in a co ed school. There was a lot of discomfort between my male and female students, especially as they were getting into adolescence. So the fewer opportunities we had for students to work together and gain an appreciation of one another's skills, the less culture and cohesion there was in this classroom, and also the fewer opportunities individual students had to, either get a release of energy, learn and refine a skill, and just like work together alongside their peers. So Teach for India allowed me to see, kind of the relationship between fiscal allocation at the city and state level and like lived experiences of students in classrooms. And then the second thing was I started getting really, really interested in the relationship between parents and children, or the relationship between the home environment and the class environment. And that's kind of why I started going back into public policy. So I applied to the University of Chicago. I was fortunate enough to be accepted, and I studied public policy through a quantitative lens. So what I really wanted to do there was take all these very qualitative interests I had and figure out how do I design interventions, which is another way of saying programs, for the populations I was interested in, but in a way that really focused on impact. So that's kind of where I am now, right? It's like, so I started with a very an interest that was based on my lived experience. I went into actually acting on that interest in college and learning about the academic structures that undergird the inequalities and the developing differences that we see in regions around the world. I wanted to teach for India to start figuring out what role I play in trying to learn about and address some of these differences. And then I went to U Chicago to learn about not only how do I address these differences, but how do I do it with efficacy? How do I do it with efficiency? How do I do it in a way that optimizes impact? I'm sure that's something that you can relate to, right? I feel like that's something that we're all doing, is trying to figure out with each successive level of professional experience or academic experience, is like trying to drill down into what our interest is and what kind of work we want to do.
Clear that at each level of experience, you refine your interest further. Are you able to maybe just touch on what studying public policy entails, what students could expect while studying public policy? And then we can maybe talk about where it led you to today,
Sure.
what you're doing now.
In terms of what public policy entails, it's what is called an interdisciplinary field, which means that it crosses more than one discipline. So, whereas you might have someone who is studying mathematics or electronic engineering or nanotechnology, um, public policy is something that crosses multiple disciplines, for example, history, economics, sociology, anthropology. So defining it can be difficult because no single university has an experience that overlaps one another. Oftentimes, there are more differences than there are similarities in terms of a student's experience of public policy. In terms of my experience, my program at U Chicago focused heavily on quantitative skills and skill development, which is why I chose it. It was really, really important for me to start looking at the hard skills that would support my work. That's why I chose the University of Chicago, is that I wanted to work on those quantitative skills, because in terms of the kind of impact I wanted to make, I know that I want to work at the community level in the nonprofit sector with human beings on grassroots interventions, but I want to have the skills and the knowledge to be able to focus on impact. So some of the classes I had the opportunity to take to this end were statistics, economics. I got to study programming through by studying Python and R. So looking at these, like I said, harder skills, and those were some of the opportunities I got at the University of Chicago. So in terms of some of the experiences that I came away from the University of Chicago with, a lot of them were kind of grounded in this understanding that we can use data to drive policy, and that's actually what their motto is making like making public policy a science. So having some sort of scientific method that supports the way in which we determine how to make public policy, how to make policy decisions. So that can look like, for example, at a local level where I have worked, right? Using data to determine which programs at the school level to financially support, or which programs to continue to fund for student education, right? So it allows me to now go backwards at some of the work I've done and look at how the skills I have now might allow me to approach the work I've done in the past differently, right? And the difference in the approach is just using data to guide those decisions.
So essentially, you need to have a mathematical brain for quantitative public policy. So I'm guessing quite a bit of it is statistics. Would you be using some equations, trying to see correlation between two factors, things like that?
Great question. There are a lot of different statistical methods that can support policy making, and it really depends on an individual's aptitude and an individual's interest, as well as, of course, access to data and the technology to run different models that support or that help us make decisions. So for me personally, I'm not deeply into statistical regressions. However, I have the skills to support it, which means that if you were to give me a statistical model, I would be able to interpret it and use that to drive a decision.
And now I think that question might lead on to what you're currently doing, what the role entails, and I guess what you're thinking of in the near future in terms of where you think this career path is heading you down.
What I'm doing now is working with Chicago's public school district. So we support over 370 schools. Specifically, I'm working on our preschool, our universal preschool program that educates 3 and 4 year olds, so the little babies, the littles as we call them. And the way in which U Chicago kind of bridged me to that opportunity was in allowing me to first, segue my professional trajectory into the public sector. I'd never actually worked in a governing capacity in the public sector. And then the second was to actually use some of these more quantitative skills to drive work from within the government. That was sort of the dream. That was the gold standard for me when I was working in Teach for India, when I was working on the ground, is trying to figure out how do I get into a decision making role. And when I'm in that decision making role, how do I try and innovate in the way that we make decisions on fiscal and resource allocation for the benefit of our students. I know lots of words, but that's kind of where I am right now. And in terms of what I want to be doing next is, simply put, it's more of this, better, right? So ultimately, we always want to be reinventing ourselves such that we are doing the same work, but we're doing it better. We're doing it with more impact. We're doing it with more finesse, with more knowledge. So ultimately, what I want to be doing is going back to working on the ground. I love working with people. I love seeing my impact happen in real time. But I want to be doing that fueled with the teachings that I've gained, both from a practical experience on the ground as well as an academic experience at U Chicago as a researcher. And we didn't really touch on that, but looking at kind of different lenses to guide the way in which I analyze social issues on the ground.
I just want to go back to what you're talking about. You're talking about 3 to 4 year olds. A lot of people would be wondering why 3 to 4 year olds. Is this a crucial age? And if it is the case, why is it a crucial age that you're working with such a young demographic?
So 3 and 4 year olds constitute what is increasingly in research and economics known as early childhood education. There's a very famous Nobel Prize winning economist who essentially elucidated the economic value of investing in education at an early age. And the idea is the more investment you allocate towards children at an early age, the greater your economic gains as a labor force, as a society. So the whole understand the like TLDR is invest in early childhood education. Too long, don't read. Like the headline is invest in early childhood education. So not just for economic reasons, but then of course for cognitive reasons. That's when a child's brain is very, very malleable. The neuroplasticity is really high. There are new neural connections being created. And so the more stimulation we can provide a student, the more words we can teach them, the more exposure we can grant them at those younger ages, the higher the chance of both positive educational outcomes as well as economic outcomes and later on in life.
And I guess this is really important because, like you're saying, their brains are really malleable, and you want to kind of create an environment that's conducive to them meeting their developmental milestones, whether they be physical, emotional, mental, social.
That's absolutely right. Um, that's well summarized.
Thanks so much. I think we're running to the end of this chat, but normally we have a closing tradition on these chats, which is um, if anyone's watching this, do you have any general piece of advice that you can give them that you think they may benefit from?
This is something that I'm still working on, but ultimately, if you're working in development or public administration or public policy, I encourage you to constantly know your story. And the way you can think about that is that if you were to be in a situation like this where you're sitting on the couch with someone, how would you explain to them what you're passionate about and how you're working on it? Some people might see it as an elevator pitch. The way I call it a story, it's the same thing. But that allows you to constantly kind of um, calibrate your actions and your professional and academic decisions to ensure that there is some consistency in the decisions you're making for yourself professionally and personally. Other than that, this has been really wonderful. Arjun and I are siblings, but we've never really talked about what we do professionally. We we more just like hang out and like muck about on inside jokes and such. So it's been really cool to talk about my professional passions with you, and I appreciate you inviting me on this chat.
And thanks so much for being a part of it. I really appreciate it. I'm sure that anyone who watches this will have learned a tremendous amount about public policy and its applicability to everyday life. Once again, thank you, and I'll catch you around.
All right.